A former military spy who stole sensitive operational equipment and developed a drug habit after a posting overseas has been convicted for drugs and burglary. Now, Corporal Richard Graham had walked away from the district court without conviction, but the Crown successfully appealed that decision to the High Court. So it went from district to high. Justice Hinton found the district court judge had erred in law when she determined the consequences of Graham's offending outweighed the seriousness of the crimes. Our court reporter Edward Gay has been looking into this High Court decision. I asked him what we know of Corporal Graham's background.
The Air Force officer spent 3 years in the sensitive specialist intelligence role. It carried a high level of risk and it included being deployed overseas. He had security clearance, a high level of security clearance, and was able to enter the storeroom on the Whenuapai Air Base. And that inside that storeroom contained what is described as operationally sensitive equipment, end quote. And we don't know any more detail than that. But
So you don't know it, or you know it and it's...
No, I honestly, hand on heart, don't know.
Okay, yeah.
And I recall Tom Furley, who covered the hearing, he actually asked the lawyers involved. They also didn't know, or at least weren't telling. So, look, that information hasn't been publicly released.
So highly secret, Edward.
Operationally sensitive. And
we shouldn't laugh.
We shouldn't laugh. We shouldn't. He also stole tools from a construction site on the airbase, and that was where workers were working on a new development. All up, the stolen items have a price tag of $200,000. During the investigation of the burglaries, the police... $200,000, yeah, that's right, of all those items. And when the cops were investigating these burglaries, they ran a search of Graham's house and also a storage unit. And inside there they found BZP pills in his house. That's the party pill drug, and in the storage unit they found 391 grams of NBOME, something I haven't heard of previously, but that's a psychoactive product similar to LSD. Police officers also found 2 cell phones, and on those phones there'd been 700 calls made in a 4-month period.
Right, discharged without conviction in the district court.
That's right, yeah. So Graham pleaded guilty in the Waitakere District Court and in front of Judge Belinda Pidwell, and he was granted a discharge without conviction in the lower court. That meant Graham walked free. He walked free from court without any of these convictions on his record.
Which would be unusual for the magnitude of the offence, right? But the justification I remember from Tom saying at the time was the circumstances in which he found himself in this position, I guess.
It's essentially this area of the law requires the judge to undergo a process where the judge looks at the seriousness of the offence and whether the consequences outweigh the seriousness of the offence. So it's a process which the judge has to go through by examining what the crime was and whether or not the consequences outweigh the crime.
So the district court judge made that determination. The Crown appealed to the High Court, right?
Yeah, that's right. Judge Pidwell basically found that Graham had planned what to steal. There was a significant breach of trust, but there was no evidence Graham had made a commercial gain. And she actually concluded there were exceptional and significant circumstances. Now, tied into that, she cited Graham's stress from the overseas deployment, a character reference from a senior officer, and Graham's rehabilitative efforts. She also concluded that if Graham was convicted, he'd likely get a dishonourable discharge from the military. That would have serious consequences on his ability to later get employment. She said he had been sent to a hostile country, had to work his own way through what had happened, and, quote her, "I do not think anyone can underestimate the effects of war on an individual," end quote.
But the Crown... So they simply weren't satisfied with the extenuating circumstances, the exercise of mercy, I guess, in a pejorative term. So what did they argue in the High Court?
Yeah, so the Crown basically essentially argued that the judge had erred in law. The Crown Prosecutor Scott McColgan actually described this case as theft as a servant on steroids, and he said that basically Judge Pidwell in the District Court had failed to determine the seriousness of the offending and also the likely consequences that would flow from it.
And the High Court judge said?
She agreed. Justice Hinton agreed. She acknowledged Graham was now drug-free, but the High Court judge also noted that the negative effect on Graham's deployment overseas. She said the court had this affidavit from the senior officer that I mentioned before, and that senior officer actually said that 3 of Graham's colleagues had approached the officer over difficulties with assimilating back into a normal life back in New Zealand. And the officer also noted that there were 5 others that had behavioural changes, as the court put it. But Justice Hinton in the High Court said Graham's offending should not be kept secret from future employers. She said regardless of whether or not Graham was convicted, the Air Force was aware of the offending. They'd take that into account when they decided his future. She also found Graham had already been given an apprenticeship in the building company, and Justice Hinton noted that no other case remotely similar had resulted in a discharge without conviction. She sent the case back to the District Court for Graham to be resentenced. Justice Hinton ended her judgment by acknowledging it was a highly unusual case. She said she accepted Judge Pidwell's comments about the difficulties of being sent by the armed forces overseas to a hostile environment and not receiving appropriate treatment on his return. She also said she was impressed by the way Graham had responded to the charges and hopes he's actually an example to others. Graham's lawyer, we've talked to him this afternoon, Carl Trotter. Mr. Trotter says he's already applied to the Court of Appeal to take the case further. He's yet to hear back from the senior court, and he wouldn't comment further.
It's Edward Gay, our court reporter.